sprang up kind of all at once.
And you had the patent, so you made some good money on it, I assume.
Well, I never patented anything. It was this was primitive down home stuff, and it started out quite primitively and just evolved as needed.
Right.
And I figured that it would cost more to patent it that's a world of different kinds of people than me, and I wouldn't be very good at it anyway. So I just made them and kept changing them and selling them.
But one does have your name on it nowadays.
It has
right?
a name. Yeah, I use my name rather than a typical name of a business because we were having a problem with the county over the building codes, and if you use a name other than your own name, you have to get a fictitious business license. So by using my own name, I didn't have to do that, and I didn't have to go into the county and ruffle feathers there.
I'm sure if we have time, we can talk about your battles with the County of Santa Cruz over living off the grid. It seems like something everyone would be encouraged to do, but it doesn't sound like when the beginning of the Back to the Land movement happened, especially in Santa Cruz County, that it was fully embraced in the way it might be now.
No, but a lot of this off-grid electricity was one of the major issues, and that turned out we were right about that. I mean, at that time, the general rule was you could run a house off-grid on a generator, but as soon as the grid was around, you had to hook up. Well, now there's a lot of off-grid disconnected systems, and of course there's net metering. So renewables won that battle.
Yay, one for humanity.
Net metering is where you can run your meter backwards. You're connected to the utility, and you become a power supplier as well as a consumer.
So, right, let's define further. Off the grid really means just that you are completely self-contained in your energy production and use, correct?
Right. The first thing that most people did is they would run their house on a 12-volt battery. And if you take the battery in, if you went to town every other day, you put the battery in your car and you had a double charging system and you'd charge the battery up. That didn't work very well because batteries don't like to be discharged deeply that way, and so it was pretty expensive, and we were buying a lot of batteries. I actually think I may have had the first solar panels in Santa Cruz County. I'm not sure about that. Somebody got some cells and soldered them together, and they were like $30 a watt. I mean, it was extremely expensive.
Now it's like $1 a watt.
Now it's under $1 a watt.
For reference.
And did you ever think we'd be here? We just had a news story that we just broke 50% solar power.
No, that's wonderful. There's something about, we talk about storage. I think that the biggest place for hydropower really now might not be so much in running power from existing falling creeks, because we've pretty well used that up in large measure, but as bad as storage. If you have what's called pump storage, when you have surplus power, you pump water from a reservoir up into a higher reservoir, and then when you need the power, you run it back down as power. And any place that you have two reservoirs or two sources of water, one above the other and not too far apart, you've done most of the work. You've got the infrastructure. All you need is a pipe and a turbine and some wires to hook it to the grid. So there's an easy way to make solar not just daytime power, which is what it is now, but make it baseline power.
So you can work together with hydro, is what
yeah,
you're saying.
you definitely need storage if you're going to have solar become a major part of the grid, because of course the sun doesn't shine at night. But it's not that hard to. And then there are batteries. Tesla. They're working on battery systems for houses. So there's a lot of thinking about how to store energy and make solar baseline power.
And what is the cost of, if you did have a stream near your home, is there any kind of barrier other than cost? Would there be some environmental laws?
There's a lot of regulatory laws, and they're very, very different from one place to another. California has quite a bit of regulation. They are pretty good at, there's a distinction between water use, of course, and has been a problem ever since probably humans one tribe was squabbling over another over water. But hydro is what's called a non-consumptive use. The interference is between where you pick it up and put it in the pipe and where you drop it back into the creek. You do have to be careful about not taking too much out, and how you take it out and how you put it in. But you're not using it. You're not pulling it out and putting it someplace else and drying the creek up in general.
So you're just diverting it in one space.
Right.
And what's the average cost if you were literally, by a creek and you wanted to pursue this? Is there a huge range? If the simplest system would be X, what would be the most complicated?
There's for little DC turbines. Of course, it depends on whether you do it yourself or you hire somebody to do it. But if you're talking about just the materials involved, The turbines run $1,000 to $2,000. The pipe can be anything from, if it's a waterfall, it's a very short pipe. If it's sort of flat land, the pipe has to be longer, and because of that, it has to be bigger. So the pipe can vary from $20 to $1,000. And then you need batteries to store it. In the early days, our houses were DC. They were kind of like big trailers. So we didn't have an inverter. So you just charged a battery, and you may need a regulator, which is another $150. And then everything ran off of that. Now that's pretty rare. Most houses are AC, and they're running conventional technology, and that requires an inverter. A little house can get by on a $1,500 inverter. A big house might be a $2,500 or $3,000 inverter. Now, there's labor, of course, involved in all of that. Laying pipe when I was young was fun. At this point, it's not so much fun anymore, and so that can add quite a bit. The same as with solar. If you put your own solar panels up, it's pretty inexpensive, but.
Wow. So I'm counting all this up, and I'm still under $10,000. And most solar systems are above that. And is this something that could power? You said a small to large house, depending on the size of.
Well, I ran my shop for a long time. I actually made kind of a point of the fact that I was using my little hydro to run the shop to make big hydro, to make many more hydro. So it was kind of a parody on nuclear power. We called it a hydro breeder.
But yeah, I saw that once. I hiked up there, and you showed me your hydro breeder factory.
Let me interject here that if people have questions for our guest, who's Don Harris, he is an inventor of hydro solar power microsystems, you can write to us at radioplanetwatch@gmail.com. That's radioplanetwatch@gmail.com. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman along with Joe Jordan, and this is Planet Watch. We're talking about micro hydropower, which is something you can do in your own backyard if you're lucky enough to live near running water. Many of us in California are not, but there are many who are.
I got a question for you, Don. What about the fish? I know that, here we got one of the world's experts on small hydropower, and yet he calls himself a turncoat because he's sort of saying nowadays that maybe the applicability of this isn't so great anymore because we're really kind of impinging on the environment. But, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I actually have changed my thinking quite a bit on that because in the beginning you didn't think too much about it. Where I live, it's a peculiar set of circumstances. There are no fish in Last Chance Creek, and that is probably the result of the fact that for a long time, Big Basin Sewage Treatment Plant was on the Waddell, and or maybe there never were, but there probably were. So I didn't have to think much about it. But it is a problem, and it's a slippery slope. We don't understand everything about how the environment works. And over the years, I've become more and more reluctant to take a lot of the water out of the creeks. I've learned more about how environmental systems work. And at this point, I encourage people to minimize their pull of the water and to stay below maybe 10 or 15% if you can. But there's always a temptation in a dry year or when you need a lot of power to plug up the creek, put a bigger nozzle in, and take more. And that's a problem because in theory, I guess you'd want to have heavy-duty regulation, but my experience with government is that regulatory agencies tend to favor big money, and so if you're little, you don't have much clout, and so it may make something almost impossible to do, and if you're big, you can essentially buy the system and do what you want. So I've tried to put in my literature as much information as I could about how to protect the environment. But now, with the price of solar under $1 a watt, there's an awful lot of places where it's more cost effective to put in a solar system than it would be to put in a hydro. And I think that's environmentally really a positive thing.
Would there be a situation where it makes total sense to put in hydro? Like, let's say you live in a really rainy part of Washington State and
sure.
have more water than sun.
As long as you're taking a small percentage of the creek, and there's a lot of places where it makes sense. Where I am, it makes sense in the winter because in fact, slightly reduces the flooding that would be going on.
And could you disconnect it? Like, if you were worried about the fish, could you, when the stream is really flowing, the winter have it running, and in the summer just take it offline?
That's what I do. I go down and turn it off.
Okay.
And now this summer, it may be enough to keep it running. It is a little easier on batteries than solar because it's 24/7 charging, and so you don't run the batteries down as much at night. and up during the day. So there's that. So it takes a smaller battery pack to run hydro for the same amount of power.
Sure.
So there are a lot of technical variabilities. But for example, in Washington, one of the things they learned is when they log an area, you can't take anywhere near as much water out of a creek as before they log it. For the reason being that fish, many species of fish are very sensitive to the temperature of the water. And when the canopy covers the creek, there's not sunlight hitting the water. But if you take half the water out of a creek, you're putting the same amount of sunlight into a smaller amount of water, and it heats it up more. And so that dramatically reduced the amount of hydro the power that they could generate out of the places up in that state.
But if you're just comparing it to big hydro dams, which pretty much stop all fish migration, I mean, we're talking about a far lesser impact, aren't we, when we're comparing those? Maybe it's apples and oranges. But.
Well, that's true, although they have come up with some pretty fancy ladders for things that sort of work. But on the other hand, a way I look at it is big hydro is like your carotid artery. But on the other hand, people, for example, that smoke a lot, all the little blood veins in their fingers stop flowing very well. And so a million little creeks can interfere with spawning as much as a big river can. So it's really all one thing, and we have to look at it that way.
Right. Great way to look at it. Joe, did you have some questions?
Well, you were talking about the economics of it and the price. One of the things I think I learned from you a while back, we talk about dollars per watt and cents per kilowatt hour, where the kilowatt hour is actually the unit of energy, electrical energy. And, solar's getting down now to where, I don't know, maybe it's in the teens, 15 cents a kilowatt hour or something. It's getting competitive with the utility mix. But I think you told me that the cost of large hydro, anyway, was like a quarter of a cent per kilowatt hour. Is that right?
Yeah, this comes out of PG&E because they have a lot of, but it's not just exactly that. The reason for that is that those hydro plants up in the Sierra were put in back when costs were much lower and environmental rules were easier. So if you did it now, it wouldn't be quite so cheap, but it's like a quarter of a cent per kilowatt hour in a wet year, what we call bus bar cost. That's the cost of the power as it enters the grid, what the utility pays for it. And so it's vastly lower. But we've kind of exhausted. That's the thing that's different between, say, wind and solar compared to hydro. Both of those, you can put solar panels pretty much anywhere. I mean, there are better and worse places for it, and the same with wind. But with hydro, there are a fixed number of creeks, and you can't make more of them. And so it's a very limited thing. And we've kind of used, at least the bigger stuff, we've used up. So it's that's a very big difference, but it's exaggerated by those historical circumstances.
Yeah, well now, though, I used to hear, I think the Union of Concerned Scientists had a slideshow that I sometimes took around, and they said that there are 30,000 small dams in the United States alone that are still actually available to be retrofitted. They're for flood control and irrigation, but they could be retrofitted or tapped off of for small hydro. Have you heard things like that?
I'm sure that's true, and of course some of them probably would be a good idea. I'm sort of involved in the reverse up on the Klamath River.
Oh,
There's
I've
an
heard
effort
that.
to try to take down some of the dams that are up there because of their not all of those are hydro dams, but their environmental impacts on the salmon runs has been fairly significant.
It's exciting to think that there's actually a movement to remove dams for the fish, especially when they're silted and not needed. We did that in the Carmel River Basin, and they did a big workaround engineering project to get the silt not to just all come down at once. It was quite complex. They rerouted the river around the dam.
Yeah.
So it can be done. And it's funny, we came here to talk about hydropower, but we're talking about another important environmental issue, which is keeping the fish alive.
Everything has its pluses and its minuses. Solar, especially if it's rooftop solar, because if you do big utility size solar, you might have an impact by covering up many square miles of earth. But if you put it on rooftops, you're putting it where that's land that's already covered. You're putting it where power is being produced, so you don't have to move it around a lot. It's really the only thing is it isn't quite so simple to figure out how to work it because it isn't the utility making the power; it's people themselves, and so that has to all be figured into the system.
Yes.
Hey, we have a question from a listener, Dan. He's saying, how scalable are these hydro systems? In other words, how many homes could one typical system support? Also, how much maintenance does one system require? And what percentage of people could use a hydro system based on where they live? Last question, what is the energy loss associated with using the hydro system to store the energy from solar?
Maybe you'll have to take them
Yeah,
one at a
maybe
time.
maybe I should just
Just
well,
ask them what
as
it's
far as the scalability question, they go all the way from 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts down to maybe 25 or 30 watts. Now, there's a big distinction between AC and DC. DC systems work up to about maybe a kilowatt or a couple of kilowatts. Beyond that, they become cumbersome, and you'd have to have a huge battery pack, but you have enough to run straight AC power. You can't run AC power on really small loads because, for example, to start a little motor or refrigerator might take 1,000 watts, but you only run 50 once it's started. With DC, you pull the power out of the battery to do that. With AC, you can't. There's no storage, so you have to have a big system. But but scalability. There's different types of turbines and different sizes from bottom to top.
Yeah, another one was
Losses in batteries, storage
Yeah.
losses. A good lead acid battery, I've had a number of different types that I've tried over the years, is about 90% efficient when they're new, but they do deteriorate over time. The typical batteries we were using were forklift batteries, and they would last about 8 years. So that is probably the dark side of off-grid power or batteries. Now, I tried nickel iron batteries, which are less efficient, but they're very environmentally benign. They were the old Edison cell. They're nickel and iron, and the electrolyte is potassium hydroxide, which is what you get in a forest fire. But they're not very efficient, and you have to replace. I used to have to carry 20 gallons a year up to put into the batteries to keep them working.
Wow.
Now the lithiums and things like that are looking like they're going to be more efficient. Lithium is especially good for cars because it's light. One of the problems I see with lithium batteries is up until recently, we weren't using much lithium, and we were getting most of it out of Bolivia.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're starting to use a lot more. Well, it turns out that there's some of the Russian republics in Afghanistan. I hate to see us using the military to defend our lithium supply like we do with our oil. But batteries, any two dissimilar materials have electrical potential. And so there are a lot of other possibilities, even a saltwater battery I've heard about. I don't know much about the efficiency of it, but I'm sure we can develop ones that are not only efficient, but also benign environmentally.
Yeah, let me see. There was also the one about what's the energy loss associated with using the hydro system to store the energy from solar. I guess that's the one you just.
The other one was about maintenance.
Yeah, the maintenance. Yeah.
Actually, it depends. For the first turbines that I built, I was using car alternators and then rewinding them. Well, those they would quit after about a year or thereabouts because the brushes would wear out. Now, the alternators pretty much run continuously. If you have a lightning strike, you might take a diode bridge out, which is mine's run 5.5 years without me touching it, and my turbine is pretty ugly. It was all parts that I couldn't sell. They were damaged cosmetically or in one way or another, so I just used them up that way. And so it's a pretty reliable technology. If you have a lot of silt in the water, particularly granular silt, decomposed granite, that can eat up a wheel pretty fast. And so what you normally do then is you put in a settling tank so that you let the particulates settle out. But I have mostly clay silt, and that just polishes things up.
Well, I had a question. You talk about being off the grid as feeling good and being independent person and not being dependent on giant electric companies. What other motivations do people tend to have to want to be off the grid? Are they thinking the grid could go down or that there's going to be a collapse of some sort? I mean, what do you think? What are the customers you deal with say to you about their reasoning why they'd want to invest in this as opposed to, something connected to the grid?
Yeah, there was a big, remember the panic over computers at the turn of the century?
Y2K?
Y2K. I sold more turbines that year, and I tried to discourage it because they thought, well, it's going to go down. My car is going to stop running. Everybody thought that was the end of the world. And I'm sure that most of those turbines are sitting unused someplace. And what I learned about that, if I were a huckster salesman, I learned something. If you tell people that, they panic and want to buy more. It's kind of like the panic over toilet papers that have happened.
Or gasoline.
And so you try to discourage it. They think that means that there's a shortage, and they'll double up and buy 2 or 3, or try to. I couldn't. It overwhelmed me at one point. And so there is that kind of thinking. And in fact, I still think if I were in town and putting a net metering system, solar panels on my roof to go into the grid, I would make it a battery-based system. In the early days, they were much less efficient, but now they're comparable efficiency. And that gives you two advantages. It gives you backup in the event that the grid goes down. You become a standalone system. And it also means that you have a way to, if the utility price goes up for connecting too high, you can do the same thing. You can say, well, it's cheaper to just buy batteries and go off grid.
So there's an economic reason.
Distribution of any kind of decentralization of energy and sovereignty, you might say, is, I think, a good thing.
Well, then you're not beholden to these wild price spikes that could happen depending on conflicts far away. But is there also some thought, and I started to read, I haven't finished, a book called The Grid that sounded like it's a lot more vulnerable than we like to think it is, just simply because it aged and it hasn't been kept up. Have you read anything about this?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, there's the smart grid that they're working on, and there's a lot of thought of what that means. Well, we were just talking the other day. Back in 1859, we think that there was a shower of high-energy particles that hit the Earth. When a solar spot erupts, it goes out kind of straight, and occasionally it'll hit the Earth. Well, at that time, there was the only long wires that really existed were the telegraph wires. And it started fires in telegraph stations all across the country as a result of that high energy. Now, if that happened now with the wires and the grid that we have, now they have tried to put in a lot of complex protections, which may or may not work. But that is a risk. Any complex system like that. And one of the things that think tank people think about, are there enough people, the old timers? In the old days, the grid worked by people would look at their meters, and if the voltage got low, they'd turn up a generator or the frequency started to get too fast. Now that's all done by computers. We don't know if there's enough of the old timers around that could do that in the event that all of the computational aspects of the thing went down.
So that's what smart meters are part of.
Or hopefully it is smart, and it isn't
smart.
more and more mechanization to where it's even less. I don't really know exactly what they're doing. The efficiency will go up because there are about 50% of the power is lost in the grid, and they can improve that dramatically. But
that's a big one.
If you just joined us, this is Planet Watch. We're talking with Don Harris, who is a micro hydropower expert and inventor here in Santa Cruz County, and has it on his own property as well as installed probably thousands of systems.
I made about 3,500 Pelton wheels, but they're not all. Some of them were replacement wheels, and some were to other people to build systems. So,
and all kinds of things are coming to mind here at once. But we have another email from Linda. What distance from the running water would make generating electricity from it not viable? And then, doesn't it matter at what grade the creek is running, and not just the volume of water available?
Good question.
Well, the second question first. The power that you get out of a hydro system is the amount of drop multiplied by the amount of water. Now, if it's not a steep grade, you have pipe loss to take into account. That means you're going to have a bigger pipe to keep the losses down.
Friction.
And that runs the price of the system up. With regard to distance, in the early days, 12, 24, and occasionally 48-volt systems were all we had for DC systems. With 48 volts, you could go maybe a third of a mile before you were starting to buy an awful lot of copper. But now we can step the voltage up just like the utility does. Some of the systems that have been put in are running at 10,000 volts, and you can run that through something not much bigger than telephone wire. So the distance really isn't a factor too much, other than that if you're running a long wire, you have to protect it and bury it, and that can be difficult. But technically, it's not a problem.
And is the Department of Energy offering rebates or some sort of subsidy to these systems that you know about?
No, California doesn't allow hydro into the net metering program. Some states do. Mostly, it's the paperwork involved in all of that is so great. I looked into it at one time, and then finally I gave up on it. I was getting ready to kind of get out of the business, and that was a world. I prefer making stuff and going tromping out into the woods. I don't particularly like dealing with governments and bureaucracy.
Probably not alone.
A couple things we can tell about Don here, besides his being a whiz on hydropower. He knows a hell of a lot about electricity, but he's also kind of what I call a friendly radical. And he's full of stories, and I have one I want him to tell us a little bit about. It was a beautiful thing, and then it turned into kind of a tragic thing. Don, you were working in the Peace Corps, right? Or you were involved down there in Nicaragua, is that right?
Well, that wasn't a Peace Corps. That was a group in Berkeley that was. It was not illegal to go to Nicaragua, but it was discouraged by the government. That was when I think Ronald Reagan was president, and the Contras were.
Yeah. Well, tell us the story of Ben Linder. Some of our listeners may remember the name Ben Linder.
Yeah, he was. Ben Linder had gone down a couple. I went down in 86. He went down about 83, and he'd been there. He actually used to ride a unicycle around to encourage the people in Managua and various places to go get vaccinations and so forth. But he was also putting hydro systems in. He put in a big hydro system. But the Contras, what Reagan called freedom fighters was really a destabilization group. They went down and that's what they wanted to destabilize that government. And he was killed. He was basically assassinated by us. But he had come out and helped us. A month before that happened, he came out and helped us with our project. He could speak Spanish well, and we had a technical problem about how to run the pipe and what way to do it, and we could hardly communicate well enough to do that, and he solved that problem. But he was then assassinated, and it became a big issue. There were 3,000 people that went to his funeral up in San Francisco, and maybe few hundred down here, all over the country. In fact, the fact that he was killed may well have been what kept us from invading Nicaragua, because I think there was an impulse to do that at the time.
So what was the deal? Why was he considered a threat?
Well, he was in a destabilization. You want to stress people to make it hard for them to live, so they'll get angry at their government. And he was doing the opposite. He was putting in power plants and helping people get by in the outlying areas, and that's what destabilization does. We do it. Other countries do it. I mean, that's just kind of the nasty habit of world politics these days, of what you do to people.
Speaking, let's see, Tommy.
Speaking of Nicaragua, I was just wondering what the hydro system is like in other countries. Like, are we technically the leader, or are other countries jumping ahead of us?
Well, at this point, we kind of tapped out early. The first big hydro system that was produced was by Nikola Tesla. And he put a system in at Niagara Falls and ran the wires from there to New York City. And that was when AC power, because there'd been a squabble on between Tesla and Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison had little DC generating stations where in town, and the power, you could only run the power a couple of blocks. The people close to the station had really bright lights, and the ones a long way off, they were dim. But he figured out AC power.
Tesla did.
Thomas Edison would work. Tesla would just pop into his head, and he saw the whole AC system and the transformer and everything all at one time. He was one of those kind of an Einstein type.
Well, yeah, and there was a story about how Tesla kind of adored and worshipped Edison, but Edison felt threatened by his brilliance and spurned him and told him to get lost. So then you ended up with what? Con Ed versus Westinghouse.
He went to George Westinghouse, and Westinghouse then backed AC power.
And also Edison was doing all these stunts, proving how dangerous AC power was by electrocuting animals, maybe even some pretty big ones.
That went on for years. They had Thomas Edison had this like a carnival show, and they would go to the pound and bring out animals and they would electrocute them with AC power to show how dangerous it was.
And it turned out DC was actually more
It
dangerous.
is more dangerous. when they, it's the reason that AC was more dangerous because it was much higher voltage. It's the voltage that's the risk. But DC power at any particular voltage is more dangerous. And the irony was that when the electric chair was developed, it was a DC device.
So
Well,
there
that's
you go.
that's sort of a tough note to leave it on. We only have a couple minutes, so let's see if we could steer it back to microhydro as a something every person could possibly do if you have a stream near you. Where could they go for more information, and where would you recommend the first stop be if you're looking outside and you're hearing the water running and it runs year round? Where would you go, and what would you share with people as some final thoughts?
Well, if in California, I would go to my neighbors first, make sure that everybody's on with you, and then I would go to the environmental department, studies department at the local school that has it, and to find out what the environmental circumstances that you're operating under. And I'd get my ducks together before I ever went and talked to government about anything.
Good idea.
Yeah.
And what about looking online or going to your site? Is there information about kind of first steps?
Well, what I would recommend is Home Power Magazine. It's a general magazine about renewables.
Holding it up to the mic here.
Yeah,
Or to the
Camera.
it's been around since 1987, and it covers all of the renewables. It started out on basic stuff, and now it's a pretty sophisticated magazine. And it's down home. I mean, it really is good in pretty much every way.
So there are contractors that do this in most communities. If you were to go wanting a professional to help you install it,
Probably not so much with hydro. I mean, plumbers, yeah. What would happen is somebody like me I'd talk to a plumbing company and tell them the particulars that are different, because plumbing is plumbing in general,
right?
and agricultural water systems are not much different than hydro systems. But there are some aspects that are specific. It's not a big industry like solar or wind is now.
Right. So if people want to contact you and have questions, are you willing to answer a few?
Sure, I'll
people?
answer questions. I'm not making them anymore.
Right.
But do I even remember my? I just got on. I just got a smartphone. I'm not very good at that yet. And what is my? Papa Don, PAPADON H2O, all small case, at gmail.com.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
PapaDonH2O at gmail.com. And you can also write to us at radioplanetwatch@gmail.com if you missed that.
Oh, yeah. And one last thing. How about a shout out to our friends at SEI, Solar Energy International? They used to do hydro workshops. Do they still do those?
They still do. I've done a few for them. Solar Energy International is a wonderful organization. I think they're spread out now. They were originally in Colorado, and I think now they're doing workshops all around.
And their website's easy to remember, solarenergy.org.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming down on Planet Watch. We're so grateful that you spent time with us to teach us about this whole different area of energy most of us
Oh, I
hadn't thought
enjoyed
about.
coming down and talking about it.
Really appreciate
It's
your
been
time.
raining lately, so it's kind of a good
It's
time
good for
that.
good year for hydro in
Yes,
California.
indeed. That's Don Harris with us on Planet Watch. Thank you for being here. And this is Planet Watch with Rachel Ann Goodman and Joe Jordan. And we are going to shift gears as we always do right about this time on the program and give you some food for thought. And that can mean just about anything. It's usually somewhat timely to the season. And I think Joe has something about palindromes, which we really had a good time with the other day, last time we talked about them.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. I'm going to mix up the order here. I want to do a little bit of sky news because, hey, just a few hours from now, tonight, is full moon. And, full moon means the moment when the moon is closest to being directly opposite the sun. Now, if it is exactly directly opposite the sun, then you can't see it. Well, it's in the Earth's shadow. It's eclipsed. You can see it by light scattered through the Earth's atmosphere around the edges of the Earth. But anyway, that's not happening. It usually skirts the edge of the Earth's shadow, and that's going to do that tonight. And on the East Coast, it's 2:08 a.m. in the wee dark hours. On the West Coast, it's 11:08 p.m. tonight.
Sweet.
And so, as I think I've said before, but hey, we get new listeners all the time. You can look for the bunny in the moon when you see the full moon, or nearby. Like last night, I saw it, and the night after the full moon, you'll see the dark patterns on the moon, which are frozen lava. They look just like a left profile of a rabbit facing to the left. and you can't miss it. You can't miss those ears up there. And they say that it's the most commonly, in all the world's cultures, more common than the man in the moon, and it's deeply related to the rabbit's foot being a good luck charm. So there you go. Now, the Easter bunny, we call, because Easter's next Sunday. It will be on here next time at Easter. And so an interesting thing is there's an astronomical origin. Have you ever wondered, why does Easter's date jump around so much? How do they calculate that date anyway? Well, here it is. It's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So let's see, does that check out? Well, the spring equinox was, March 20th a while back, and then we're having a full moon now, and then next Sunday will be the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. Now, as for why that algorithm is there, that's buried in history and culture and religion and all that stuff.
And wasn't Ishtar the name originally given to...
Oh, to Easter? Oh, that makes sense. Ishtar, Easter, it's kind of fascinating how these words and things.
And how often are lunar eclipses? 18.5 years or something like that? Or did I...
There are cycles, Saros cycles, Saros, which group solar eclipses and lunar eclipses. But heck, you can see a lunar eclipse every couple or 3 years. They're visible from all over half of the world. Whereas solar eclipses, like the one this August, they are such a narrow path, maybe 60 to 100 miles wide, going across part of the earth, and we're lucky this summer to have it going across the U.S. Those you have to be in the right place. It's a lot harder to get to those. They come around every few years too, but you coming right to your doorstep? No, it's going to be a long time.
And how many have you seen? How many lunar eclipses?
Lunar eclipses, tons of them. I don't know, dozen, maybe more than a dozen.
More than everyone else in this room.
Heck, 4 in just the last couple of years. They had a foursome every half a year, But solar eclipses, I've seen 4 total eclipses of the sun, and you have to do this. Or as my dad used to say, if you haven't seen that, then you haven't lived. That was his phrase.
Have not
you haven't lived. But anyway, I'll tell you more later about why that is. But back to palindromes and how much time? Oh, we got plenty of time here. Right.
It's going to be a long palindrome.
Yeah, well, I did a bunch of them the other time. And did I do the longest one, like on our first show when we did that? Did I do the one about Doc, Note, I dissent, a fast, never... Now, I'm popping my P there on purpose because this one I'm going to do as a riddle. A palindrome is a word or phrase or sentence that is spelled the same forwards as backwards. I'm not going to do the whole one for you. I'm going to give you the first half of it, and then you can just write it down and reflect it around and figure out where the spaces go to get a sentence that makes sense. So here's the first half of this palindrome.
Okay,
and next week we'll do the whole thing. Okay, we'll give you the answer. So here we go. Doc, note, I dissent, a fast, never P. The P at the beginning of the next word, that's the pivot point of this. That's the center of this palindrome.
And is DOC, D-O-C?
D-O-C, like a doctor.
Okay.
Good question. Not like a doc that you walk out
Spelling
on.
matters.
And note, like...
Say it again.
Note. Doc, note, a fast... No, sorry. Doc, note, I dissent. And that's not decent. It's dissent, like disagree. So Doc, note, I dissent. A fast, never P. So,
All right.
figure it out. Just all you have to do is take those letters and write them in reverse, and then, but you'll just get a string of letters. You'll have to figure out where the spaces
How many more words are there?
Oh, how many was that? 7 or 8 or 9?
So it's about halfway?
Probably about the same. Yeah, it's halfway.
Okay.
So I got some more here. I mean, there is a single word. As far as I know, the longest single word palindrome is the name of a language that is spoken in Southeast Asia called Malayalam. M-A-L-A-Y-A-L-A-M. Malayalam. So that's a palindrome.
Yeah.
Now, other palindromes are like a Toyota. That's a palindrome. A Toyota. Or there's a bakery up in the town way up in far northern California called Yreka. There's Eureka, but then way up near the border with Oregon, Yreka, Y-R-E-K-A. So it's Yreka Bakery. That's a palindrome.
Oh, I love that.
Yreka Bakery.
That's wonderful.
And, okay, now here's a couple longer ones. I'll just say it first, and then if you have questions, we can discuss it. Tell me if this makes sense. Loops are macaroni art, a train, or a camera spool.
Wow.
Loops are macaroni art, a train, or a camera spool. You know, a train going around and around in circles, that's a loop, and you can make, you know, those little curly macaroni things into a loop. And a camera spool, of course, that's a... So there you go. Now, I'll do one more here. This is kind of complicated and ingenious. Okay, so you got a gal named Nora, Nora, and there's this guy, a wastrel. You know what a wastrel is? It's somebody who just wastes his time, wastes his life. He's good for nothing. Wastrel Aaron, Aaron. Okay, now Nora is spending her time industriously sawing logs that are adorned with the flower goldenrod. So here comes the palindrome. Nora, alert, saws goldenrod adorned logs. Wastrel Aaron.
Wow. That takes
Nora,
some time.
alert, saws goldenrod adorned logs. Wastrel Aaron.
They don't have to make complete sense unless you have to explain them. I always liked failures of punctuation, and there's a whole book of these, but there's a book called The Panda Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, and if you don't punctuate it right, he eats, shoots, and leaves.
Makes a fast getaway.
And then there's Let's Eat Grandma. Let's eat, Grandma. It's problematic, but unless you're a cannibal. So there's those fun punctuation games that you can play. I play them with my students, trying to teach them writing tricks.
Victor Borg, the great comedian and world-class pianist from Denmark, was good for all sorts of fun things like that. And one of his best jokes that I heard at a show of his that I saw was he said a woman came up to him after one of his comedy acts and said, "I haven't laughed so hard since my husband died." That's your classic double entendre, you know, like, "Oh, you made me laugh again," or "I was really laughing when he croaked." But anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it depends on how you take the meaning.
And here's a little math thing, which is very appropriate for our honored guest here, Don Harris, because he deals with things that are falling. And, you know, water, parcels of water. And, when things fall, due to the acceleration, which is due to the Earth's gravity, they accelerate. You know, they move faster and faster. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of this because, well, you have air resistance, which kind of, you know, cuts into that acceleration, and you don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. But let's put it this way: when you jump off the top of a tall building, it is the acceleration that kills you, because you're moving a lot faster when you get to the bottom than you were at the top when you first jumped off. But anyway, so when something falls, forgetting about air resistance, it moves a certain distance in the first second. Let's just call that distance, you know, x. In the second alone, it moves 3 times that distance. In the third second, it moves 5 times that initial distance. So it's x, and then 3x, and then the next second 5x, and then the next second 7x, 9x. Okay, well, so here's the question. What is the total distance it's fallen after any given number of seconds? And so it's the same question as just, what do you get when you add up all the odd numbers one by one? You know, 1, and then add 3 to that, you get 4. And then you add 5 to that, you get 9. And you add 7 to that, 16. Okay, I'm going to leave this as a riddle. There is a pattern to those numbers, a very magical pattern. You add up each next odd number, and you get a special number in a special series. So what do we have so far? 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. This is how things fall. This is a picture of the acceleration. You know, in each successive second, they're moving at these. But when you add them up, the total distance they've fallen is that latest series, the 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. What is that? That's a sequence of some kind of special numbers.
Are you going to answer that next week?
Yeah, remind me.
Cliffhanger.
Yeah.
So I
36 and 49 are the next couple of them, by the way.
There's a hint. So I have a kind of a question along those lines, since you mentioned water falling in honor of our guest. When I was a kid, we had this long argument after coming down the Nepali Trail, the 3 of us kids, about whether water falls or slides, whether a waterfall is falling or sliding. And I guess it depends on if it's free falling, but even when it's free falling through the air to the ground, it's sliding over other water molecules, right? So wouldn't you call it a water slide no matter what? Is that just semantics? I mean, were we just parsing meaning, or did they really slide? What do you think, Joe, physicist?
A descending sheet of water.
That's so not waterfallish. We had to come up with shorthand for something to call that thing that falls off of a cliff when it's wet.
Mm-hmm.
Yosemite would be not the same if it was that what you mentioned. So
That's you bring up a good point. Now would be a good time, and like for the next month, to get thee to Yosemite.
the spring
It's gonna
runoff
be
is
pretty
going
amazing.
to be amazing. Yeah,
Wow.
and it just still snowed this last week and may snow again. So the spring runoff for hydropower people is going to be phenomenal. And as you said, it may be more than the hydropower people can even handle in California. They'll be shutting down or over diverting some of the dams.
You just hope that you had a good bypass for the water.
And that Oroville Dam holds up, right? Because it's still in danger, I think. Didn't get totally fixed. Well, we're just about out of time. This has been Planet Watch for another afternoon. We so much appreciate you tuning in. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman.
And Joe Jordan, keep an eye on the sky.
And I'm Tommy Martin.
Thank
With
you so
Don
much for
Harris.
listening. And thank you to Don Harris for being our guest today on Planet Watch. Join us next week for another conversation about big solutions to planet-size problems.
CBS News, I'm Pam Coulter. The State Department is condemning